Prince Amir sat upon his royal steed, gazing out over the valley that separated his kingdom from that of their most bitter enemy, the kingdom of Eldra. The kingdom he ruled, Merid, had been at war with Eldra for years. His father, King Suleiman, had died on the battlefield, leaving Amir with the heavy responsibility of leading their armies. And lead them he did, with pride and a fierce desire to protect his people. Yet, as the days stretched into months, and months into years, the war seemed endless, a cycle of bloodshed with no clear victor. Amir, though a prince, had been raised as a soldier. His life had been one of discipline, of following the orders of his late father, and of maintaining the honor of his kingdom. But deep within him, a sense of weariness had begun to take root. He had witnessed countless battles, seen the carnage of war, and felt the weight of command upon his shoulders. And though he knew the importance of their fight, a small voice inside him wondered whether it would ever end. That day, as he stood by the valley overlooking the Eldrin kingdom, his mind was not on the battle ahead. It was on something else, something he could not yet explain. For weeks, he had heard rumors of a mysterious woman, a warrior unlike any other. She was said to be the daughter of Eldra's king, a fierce fighter who led her father's armies with unparalleled skill. Her name was Lady Selene. Amir had heard of her, of course. Every soldier in Merid knew her name. She was the enemy, his enemy, but there was something in the whispers, something in the stories that piqued his curiosity. He had heard tales of her beauty, of her bravery, of her unmatched prowess with a sword. Yet it was not these rumors that captured his attention. It was something deeper, something that called to him in ways he couldn't understand. He had seen her once, briefly, on the battlefield. The clash of steel and the chaos of war had obscured most of his vision, but he had caught a fleeting glimpse of her. She was taller than most women, her figure commanding even in the heat of combat. Her eyes, a sharp and calculating shade of gray, had locked onto his for a split second. A look almost imperceptible, but one that had stayed with him long after the battle was over. He couldn't explain why, but in that moment he had felt an inexplicable pull toward her. But it was madness, he knew. She was the enemy, the daughter of the king who had led his people to war for so long. She was no ally, she was a threat, a force of nature in her own right. Yet, despite this, Amir could not shake the thought of her. And so, as the war raged on and the fate of both kingdoms hung in the balance, Prince Amir found himself in the strangest of predicaments, caught between duty and something far more dangerous. His love for his kingdom, his sense of responsibility to his people, battled against an emotion he had never known he could feel, love, or something close to it, for someone who should have been his enemy. On the eve of a great battle, as he sat alone in his tent, preparing for the upcoming conflict, Amir could not rid himself of the thoughts that consumed him. His generals had arrived with reports, his advisors were busy strategizing, and yet his mind was elsewhere. The weight of the crown, of the sword at his side, felt heavier than ever before. He was expected to lead, to win. He could not afford to be distracted. Yet, how could he deny the strange feelings that stirred within him whenever he thought of her? That night, as the moonlight bathed the battlefield in a soft glow, Amir found himself at the edge of the camp. His horse stood still, as if aware of the tension that gripped its rider. The sound of distant drums echoed in the night air, signaling the preparations for war. But it wasn't the drums that caught Amir's attention, it was a figure in the distance, moving through the trees. He knew immediately who it was. Lady Selene. She was standing at the edge of the enemy camp, her silhouette barely visible in the dark. For a moment, Amir simply watched her, mesmerized. Her movements were graceful, yet deliberate, like a predator in the wild. She was alone, which only made her presence more striking. There was a quiet strength in the way she stood, a confidence that commanded respect. Despite the distance between them, Amir could feel the pull of her. Without thinking, he dismounted and began walking toward her. The night air was cool against his skin, and the soft crunch of gravel beneath his boots was the only sound he could hear. He moved cautiously, aware that the slightest misstep could alert the guards, but his mind was clouded with the desire to see her again, to understand what it was that drew him to her. As he neared the edge of the camp, Selene turned, her eyes locking with his. The intensity of the moment was enough to stop him in his tracks. She said nothing, but there was a recognition in her gaze, a recognition that mirrored his own. For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension between them was palpable, and the air seemed to vibrate with the unspoken understanding that neither of them was truly an enemy to the other, despite the war that raged between their people. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her voice low but firm. Amir took a step closer. "Neither should you." For a moment, there was a brief flash of surprise in her eyes, but it quickly faded into something else, something almost like amusement. "You know what will happen if they find us here," she warned. "I do," Amir replied, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "But sometimes, war is not just fought on the battlefield." "Then what is it you're fighting for, Prince Amir?" she asked, her tone skeptical. He paused, caught off guard by the question. What was he fighting for? Glory? Honor? Victory for his kingdom? All of these seemed like distant concepts now. In the face of this woman, this enemy, they felt hollow. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I don't know anymore." Selene studied him for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face as though trying to read him. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Amir standing alone in the moonlight. He stood there for a moment longer, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. And then, for the first time in a long while, Amir questioned everything he had known. His duty, his kingdom, his war, all of it seemed so insignificant in that fleeting moment with Selene. As the days passed and the battle loomed closer, Amir could not get the encounter out of his mind. He knew what he must do. He had to lead his men, to secure victory for his kingdom. And yet, he could not shake the thought of her, her eyes, her voice, the brief connection they had shared. The battle would come, but Amir knew that whatever happened on that day, his heart was no longer solely with his kingdom. It had been claimed by an enemy, and a love he could not control. The days leading up to the battle were filled with tension. The war that had raged for so long was nearing its climactic point, and both kingdoms were preparing for what could be the final confrontation. Prince Amir, despite the heavy burden of his responsibility, found himself distracted in ways he had never experienced. His thoughts kept returning to Lady Selene, to the brief moment of connection they had shared under the moonlit sky. Each night, he stood at the edge of his camp, eyes scanning the enemy lines across the valley, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that he might catch another glimpse of her. But she did not return. Whether it was by design or mere coincidence, he could not say. And yet, her absence only seemed to deepen the pull he felt toward her. As Amir prepared his troops for the battle, his generals came to him with maps and strategies, offering their insights and urging him to stick to the plan. His kingdom, Merid, had long been the stronger of the two, but the Eldrins were fierce, and their queen, Selene's mother, was known for her cunning tactics. The stakes were high, this battle would decide the fate of both kingdoms. But as Amir reviewed the maps with his generals, his thoughts wandered. He couldn't bring himself to focus entirely on the battle plan. He couldn't ignore the question that haunted him: what was it that drew him to Selene? How could he reconcile his feelings for someone who was supposed to be his enemy? His younger brother, Prince Zaid, seemed to sense his distraction. Zaid was a sharp strategist, well-versed in the art of war, and though he lacked Amir's natural leadership presence, he made up for it with his practical thinking. "You're distracted," Zaid said one evening as the two of them sat in Amir's war tent. "This is no time for hesitation. The battle is almost upon us. You have to be sharp, Amir." Amir looked at his brother, his brow furrowed. "I know," he replied, his voice tight. "But how can we fight for something when we're unsure of what we're fighting for?" Zaid's expression softened slightly. "You're still questioning this war? You were born to lead, Amir. Our people depend on you." "I know," Amir muttered, but his mind was elsewhere. Zaid studied him for a long moment. "Is it her, then?" he asked quietly. Amir's heart skipped a beat. He had not spoken of Lady Selene to anyone, not even Zayd. "What are you talking about?" "I've seen the way you've been looking across the valley," Zayd said, his tone gentle but knowing. "You haven't been the same since that night." Amir's face flushed with embarrassment. "It's nothing," he muttered. Zayd shook his head. "It's never just nothing, Amir. You're a prince, yes, but you're also a man. And men feel things, sometimes in ways they don't expect." Amir remained silent. He could not deny what his brother was saying, but he was not ready to acknowledge it fully. It was madness, surely. He was supposed to lead his kingdom to victory, not allow emotions to cloud his judgment. But his heart seemed to defy reason, pulling him toward something he knew was forbidden. The battle began the next morning. The roar of the armies could be heard long before the first clash of swords and shields. Amir, clad in his royal armor, stood at the forefront of his troops, his sword gripped tightly in his hand. His generals rallied their men, and the ground beneath their feet trembled as the two armies collided. The sound of battle was deafening, the clash of steel, the cries of men, the pounding of hooves as cavalry charged into the fray. Amir fought with a fury that surprised even himself. His sword was swift, his movements precise. He had been trained for this, and he executed every strike with deadly intent. Yet, even in the midst of the chaos, his mind would often wander. His eyes would drift across the battlefield, searching for her. And then, in the distance, he saw her. Lady Selene. She was leading the Eldrin forces with unmatched grace, her sword flashing as she cut down anyone who dared to approach her. She was everything the stories had said, tall, poised, and impossibly beautiful even in the midst of battle. But it was not her appearance that caught Amir's attention. It was the way she moved, confident, lethal, and unyielding. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Amir couldn't look away. Their eyes met for a split second, across the chaos of war. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like an eternity. There was no hatred in her gaze, no anger, just something else. Something neither of them could name. Amir's heart pounded in his chest. This was madness. They were on opposing sides. And yet, for that brief moment, there was no war between them. Only a strange, unspoken understanding. The battle raged on, but Amir's focus wavered. He was no longer fighting the enemy with his full heart. His thoughts were with her, Selene, the woman who had somehow taken root in his soul. He couldn't explain it, but he couldn't deny it either. The hours stretched on, and the tide of battle began to turn. The Eldrins were retreating, their forces dwindling under the might of Merid's soldiers. But Amir couldn't bring himself to enjoy the victory. In the distance, he saw Selene's banner fall, her warriors scattered. He knew she must be somewhere, still fighting, still leading her troops with the same fierceness. And so, with his heart racing, Amir dismounted from his horse, leaving his men to continue the pursuit. He needed to find her. He pushed his way through the battlefield, ignoring the cries of dying men and the shouts of soldiers. He moved swiftly, his mind focused on one thing, finding her. The rest of the world faded into the background as he made his way through the chaos, his only thought of the woman he had come to care for despite everything. Finally, he found her. She was standing alone, her back to him, her sword resting at her side. She was breathing heavily, her armor battered from the fight, but her posture was still regal, still commanding. When she turned to face him, her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Why did you come?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the dying battle around them. Amir swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't have an answer. There was no rational explanation for his actions. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. He took a step closer. "Because I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice hoarse. Selene's expression softened, though there was still a wariness in her eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said again. "You should be with your people." They need you. I know, Amir replied, taking another step toward her. But I can't fight this anymore. I can't fight what I feel. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The battlefield around them seemed to fall silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, Selene spoke again, her voice low but steady. "And what is it that you feel?" she asked. Amir took a deep breath. "I feel as though I've lost something I didn't even know I was searching for." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she stepped closer to him. "Amir," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You're not the only one who feels this." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was the gentlest of touches, yet it felt like an explosion inside him. The war, the kingdom, their families, all of it seemed so far away in that moment. The only thing that mattered was this, her.